Hey, hi, and hello, everyone. Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. I hope you're doing well. Thank you very much for clicking on this video. Really, thank you, because it's a tier list where I go over the particular catalog of an artist or group. I rank out their main core albums from S to F tier. In this one, it is the classic and groundbreaking hip-hop trio, De La Soul, the boys from Amityville, that would be Posdnuos, Trugoy, rest in peace, and DJ Maceo, aka Plug 1, Plug 2, and Plug 3. Their catalog has been the subject of a lot of discussion, a lot of discovery, and a lot of headlines as of late because just this month it became much more widely available than it has been in the past. We don't need to get into why, all the sample clearances and label disputes, very justified label disputes with the group. Let's focus on the music because the music is great and the music is worth focusing on as we go through this tier list. Here we go. We are going to start from the debut to the final record from the group. So here we go. 3 Feet High and Rising, the trio's 1989 album. I love this record personally. I think it's fantastic. I think it is amazing. I think it's an important transition point album for the genre of hip hop as well. Not only do you have a lot of the rhythms and perks and breaks that were so prevalent within hip hop throughout its golden era in the 80s featured on this album, but simultaneously you have a lot of characteristics, styles, aesthetics, and ideas that would become so much more popular down the road through the 90s as jazz rap became more prevalent. In terms of the style of humor and wit that De La Soul were bringing to the table, the flows they were bringing to the table, the kinds of samples that we were hearing on the record thanks to Prince Paul, the general vibes of this record, which you could also hear echoed, yes, on other albums and in other collectives that were centered around this like native tongues movement in New York at the time. But De La Soul had so many things about them specifically that made them stand out and made them almost incomparable to many of their contemporaries, even the most similar ones, which is especially the case on this album. Like where to start, because you have so many lyrically focused bops on this thing. The focus and lyrical chemistry between all involved is something to behold. And on top of that, like the sense of humor and satire that De La Soul is bringing to the table too on this record. Like, obviously I wouldn't go as far as to call this a comedy album, but there's so many parts of it that are freaking hilarious. Be they the whole game show progression or silly little sidebar skits, silly lyrical routines they go through here and there, or just bars or songs that like make fun of other things going on in rap music at the time. Because while De La Soul was very specific in what they were also very conscious of what they didn't want to be, and were so antithetical to certain things going on in rap music and popular music at the time that they would kind of outright lash out at it in a mostly good-natured way. Again, I think this record is amazing. It's fantastic. It's one of the best rap records of all time, especially for the era it came out of. I would put this very solidly in the S tier. Okay, following this, we have the sophomore record from the trio. That is the 1991 album De La Soul Is Dead, which I think requires a little contextualizing and explaining given the title and given the cover. As I was saying earlier, De La Soul was very aware in their music of what they wanted to be, what they didn't want to be, and of course, you know, with that being the case right from the start, they were very, I would say, reactive to the way their music and the way their message was being received as 3 Feet High and Rising became a hit in its own right. And they didn't really take to how a lot of people were calling them like a hippie group. They didn't like the way some of the aesthetics and messaging were reflecting on them, so they pretty much took it upon themselves to kill it in a sense, kill this whole Daisy Age thing by giving us a pot of dead flowers on the front, telling us De La Soul is dead in a sense. And while in some respects I get this, I understand this, as an artist, of course, you want to kind of control the way people perceive what it is you do, especially when you're talking about a black art form that's being so heavily commodified in a white music industry. But this reaction led to a pretty obvious attitude change on this record as well. I wouldn't say this album is like dark or angsty or anything like that, but kind of gone is a lot of the carefree and positive energy that made 3 Feet High and Rising such a compelling and such a fun and interesting record to listen to. Plus, with hip-hop in a broader sense becoming even more about certain things, violent themes, so on and so forth, that the trio weren't necessarily big fans of, it seemed like they had even more to comment on or call out in terms of trends they didn't really like. So I point that out to say that De La Soul is Dead is just not nearly as upbeat an album, but there are still so many great things about the trio that carry over onto this album. 1, their sense of humor. 2, their rap skills, their lyrical focus. We get an even better batch of beats from Prince Paul on this one because the rhythms and the samples on this one are heavier, they're smoother, they have more of a classic 90s boom bap feel to them too. The group chemistry, the earworm choruses from the debut also carry over onto this record. For all intents and purposes, if you love the debut, you're probably going to love this as well. The only thing that holds me back from enjoying this as much is that it's a little heavy-handed, I think, with some of the skits and with the tracks that are, I guess, more of a satirical style. And while I get what the group is trying to get across on tracks like Kicked Out the House, for example, they're funny, but also kind of obnoxious on repeat listens. And in my opinion, it sort of takes away some of the shine from the better and more serious and more skilled tracks on the LP, like Millie Pulled a Pistol on Santa. All that being said, though, still a great record, still groundbreaking, still amazingly produced and written in most of its pockets. I would very firmly place this album in the A tier. Okay, next we have the group's third LP, which is Buhloone Mindstate, which again is a fantastic and really interesting album from the group, and the last LP they did that had pretty much a full run of beats from Prince Paul. Now, on this LP, the aesthetics of jazz rap in the 90s were in full swing, and you can absolutely hear it on nearly every part of this record. In fact, De La Soul was so dedicated to the vibe on this album, they actually had real-life jazz musicians playing on the record. This thing wasn't just all samples. This record is also a pretty bold change from their past 2 albums as well. The track list is a lot trimmer. It's not heavily loaded with skits. It also doesn't really have any songs that you could outright say are satirical or just comedic in nature. So in a way, the overall tone of this album is a little more serious, especially since the trio seems to be pretty focused on the idea of hip-hop, again, being further commodified and commercialized and exploited in the music industry and the entertainment industry. I think the intro track pretty much gets the idea of this across, making mention of things blowing up and going pop, as it were. The lyrical chemistry, the topical focus, the songwriting ability, all of that carries over once again onto another creative batch of tracks, which I think, stick out pretty nicely because there's not a lot of filler around them to distract from the talent and immense amount of creativity going into these tracks. And again, the very jazz-centric production and the level of detail and the jazz embellishments going into these beats are amazing too. Fantastic highlights on this thing like Ego Trippin' Part 2 as well as Break of Dawn. One of my favorite De La tracks, In the Woods, which is incredibly eerie, is on this thing as well. And also featuring Japanese rappers on a record in this day and age I don't think anybody else was doing too. There are a lot of, again, cutting edge and ahead of the curve things going on with this record. I would put this record in the A tier pretty handily. It's not as robust or I think as fun as the debut, but it's still an amazing and fantastic record. Okay, following this, we have another beloved album from the group that is their 1996 LP, Stakes is High, which again is critically acclaimed, loved by fans, mentioned in the same breath as the 3 albums I have spoken about so far, but I personally am not as crazy about this record. And look, there are a lot of things I love about this album. I love that Common is on this record killing it. I love that we have a young Mos Def on this record as well. The album art, like seriously, this cover art goes hard as fuck. But here's the thing. I just think this album is boring, which sucks to say, and I can't believe I'm saying it, but here's the thing. I get why people love this record because I think for an album of this style, and look, this album is very much still in that jazz rap vein that the group was kind of pulling from on Buhloone Mindstate, and I think it checks a lot of those basic classic jazz rap boxes that you want an album from this era to check. You've got those jazzy beats, you've got those smooth grooves, you've got those chill vibes, you've got those kind of laid back deliveries, you have the witty lyricism, you have everybody playing off of each other. Every time I put this album on, I hear tracks on it I enjoy, but the overall experience as a record is just very bloated. It's tedious. It just drags on for so long. I feel like a lot of the tracks on this thing could have been trimmed down, and I just don't find a lot of tracks on this LP that approach with creative or memorable song topics or like lyrical routines or angles, like in the case of the song Area, for example, off of Buhloone. I think the record is a head bobber. I think it's got a lot of good qualities to it, but overall, as an album experience, I just think it's kind of weak. I just kind of pull my favorites out of this one and I stick to those, and I don't really dig too deep into the record beyond that. I get why people love it, but I just think it's a little too bloated and just not nearly as vibrant, creative, out there, eccentric as the group's albums so far, which I think is, kind of what made De La Soul so interesting in the first place. So I would put this in the C tier. Okay, next, this should be interesting because we are transitioning into a new era for the trio now. We have the first record from their Artificial Intelligence series, Mosaic Thump, which is the first of what was supposed to be 3 records. Now, because of, basically the progression of those albums and label dispute stuff, they didn't actually end up dropping the 3rd album on time or dropping it sort of as a part of the series. So a lot of people, a lot of fans, a lot of critics sort of look upon these records with sort of a side eye and don't take them as seriously as they do like their first 4 albums. Plus, I mean, let's face it, a lot of rappers and groups from the 90s had a pretty difficult transition into the 2000s, easily making some of their worst records ever. However, I'm here to say the Artificial Intelligence records, I think, are as worthy of serious consideration as anything else De La Soul has put out. I find De La Soul's deliveries and performances on this record to be really upbeat and vibrant. I think in a way they kind of get that old school like eccentricity and fun and attitude back in the mix on this record. I don't know what it is about this album, but it seemed like they were genuinely excited to make these songs and make this new series and kind of define themselves in a new era in a way. Look, there are problems with this record. Problems that have been widely documented and acknowledged time and time again through review after review, reaction after reaction. There are some tracks on this thing where aesthetically and stylistically the group sort of sounds like they're a little bit out of their depth. They're trying something that is not necessarily in their wheelhouse, be it on You Can Do or My Rights, but I think they hold their own. Going deeper, there are respectable crossovers with the likes of Redman and Busta Rhymes, also 2/3 of the Beastie Boys. On the closing track, You Don't Want to Bust That Shit. I think they sort of take a more hardcore and aggressive attitude, but take the messaging and make it fit with something that is more in their style in terms of like a more anti-violence thing. The Art of Getting Jumped is great. Declaration is great. Look, there are a lot of highlights on the record, in my opinion, in terms of, again, like MCing, rapping, writing, song ideas. But then there's like the production side of things, which isn't terrible. There's like way worse beats on way worse hip hop albums throughout the 2000s. But look, the very stiff, very synthetic, very rigid, and very regimented rhythms on this record just don't sound as good. It just don't have that wonderfully soft, fuzzy texture of a lot of the jazz rap that was on their past couple of records, or, the kind of rough and tumbled beats that were on their first 2 albums. So I do think there is like a little bit of magic being lost on the production side with this LP, sadly. But I do appreciate the group trying to like update a little bit and make an album that sounds modern. You can hear in pockets of this album that, they're thinking about, yeah, this has got to be like the future, the internet, the modern era. Again, I think it's sort of there at points, in places, but simultaneously, albums that came out 2 years prior, like Beastie Boys' Hello Nasty, for example, sound way more futuristic aesthetically and production-wise than this thing does. If only you could take the rapping and the energy coming off of the mic on this album and take the beats from Stakes is High and somehow make them cross over, you'd have quite an interesting album, in my opinion, from De La. But, you know, we don't have that. What we have here is an interesting record, but still like a flawed record. I would put this in the C tier. All right, next we have De La Soul's next Artificial Intelligence album, Bionics. This one came out just a year later in 2001. And keep in mind, the last one dropped again in 2000. That was a pretty sizable album. This one as well is like an hour-long offering, and the next record, which was spoken about, you know, on this album as, you know, it's going to come out soon, was set to drop in 2002. And if everything had gone to plan, that most likely would have been another pretty lengthy album as well. So what the trio was undergoing here, or trying to accomplish, was pretty ambitious in terms of trying to make these modern hip-hop aesthetics during, you know, the front end of the bling era work in their favor. And you know what, in my opinion, as far as Bionics goes, I think they do a much better job of that. I think the vibrance in De La Soul's flows and delivery is still maintained on this record. The lyrical and topical focus is still there. From CeeLo to Devin the Dude to Be Real, the feature list on this thing bangs. I also have to add that one of the greatest feats in music is accomplished on this album as well, because the track Simply, which famously samples Paul McCartney's Wonderful Christmas Time, turns one of the worst Christmas songs ever invented into actually like a good hip hop song. They really turn one of my least favorite tracks ever into a good track, a good song. Overall, the production on this record, in comparison with Mosaic Thump, is actually a lot better, a lot smoother. The eclectic and colorful samples and bits of instrumentation feel more specific to them and their style. The poppier moments on the LP, which I think some fans took issue with, the way De La Soul were implementing them on Mosaic Thump, I think are pulled off with a bit more flair, a lot more taste this time around. The Reverend Do-Good skits are consistently funny. The only time the album, I think, really takes a nosedive and goes to crap, kind of, is around the track Pawn Star, which I get the angle of that song and I respect it, but the incessant porn samples throughout the track suck ass. The beat on What We Do for Love bites as well, and it's not the strongest Slick Rick feature I've ever heard. But the album ends pretty strong beyond there. Yeah, Bionics, I think, has a really solid track list to it, and is a really good, really respectable album, and is a little underrated, I think, because it's kind of the middle child in a series that was never really finished. But I think if you really kind of appreciate what the group had to offer artistically at their core on their earliest records, you're still going to find a lot of that energy. You're still going to find a lot of that artistry on Bionics if you give it a shot. I would put this album in the B tier. Okay, next we have their 2004 album, The Grind Date. Now, as I told you guys earlier, Artificial Intelligence, which was supposed to be a trio, didn't get finished. Did not get completed. There is no third installment in the series. What ended up happening a few years after schedule, we ended up getting The Grind Date, which has been said by many to be a record that was filled with tracks that would have at one point been on that third installment of AOI, but just, you know, again, it didn't end up coming to be. And what we have here as a result is miraculously a pretty good album anyway. Maybe in some respects, The Grind Date is not the record we were intended to get, but it's still a very good album with one of the best feature lists of any De La Soul record. Ghostface is on here, MF Doom is on here, Common comes back, Flava Flav is in the mix too, but with the group linking up with dudes like Jay Dilla as well as Madlib on production for some of the beats with this one, they really kind of get back in tap with like what exactly made them such a special group to begin with. Because you know, producers like that were heavily influenced by De La Soul's early work. So in a way, aesthetically and production-wise, you have things coming full circle on this album in a really cool and a really interesting way. Because you know a dude like Madlib, especially Madlib, was taking notes from those early LPs, picking up on the eclectic samples, the attitude, the cheekiness. All of this culminates into a really good, tight series of tracks where, you know, know, there's not a whole lot of dramatics. There's not a lot of skits. There's not a lot of filler. There's not a lot of silliness. It's got more of a cut and dry presentation like Buhloone Mindstate did, but that doesn't really necessarily hurt it all that much in my opinion. What we have on the grind date is just a very solid batch of well-produced tracks with great rapping, great performances, great songwriting. Like, obviously not as eclectic or as groundbreaking or as wild as their early stuff, but again, it's an album that I think is a tad bit underrated, and because it came out in the 2000s and was at the tail end of this trio that didn't really get completed, it's not taken as seriously as it should be, but it's a really great record, in my opinion. It's a really great record. I would put it in the B tier. All right, next I want to quickly mention Plug 1 and Plug 2 detouring into a bit of a side album here under the group name First Serve, which again, obviously is not an official De La Soul project or anything like that, but I still think is like worth noting if you want to hear the entire trajectory of the group. It is an interesting concept album about a hip hop outfit that kind of is trying to make it in the industry, and they blow up and they break up, and it's kind of the highs and lows of all that. Now, I will say I do think the narrative is a bit heavy-handed. It falls flat in some places. I think some of the rapping and the songs suffer at the hand of like trying to force the whole story and everything from beginning to end. And in retrospect, it's a tale that isn't told with, I guess many interesting twists and turns, I suppose. We've had many instances of far more interesting commentary along these lines on albums since this thing dropped back in when did this come out? 2012? Look, it's got some bops on it. It's an interesting concept. I think, again, it kind of falls flat. I would put it in the C tier. Again, not a core De La record, but one that's worth noting and mentioning for sure. Okay, and finally, we have the group's last album dropped in 2016, and The Anonymous Nobody. This album caused a lot of heads to turn because I don't think anybody expected in 2016 for the trio to reform and come out with a new record. But we got it. It exists. It happened. It's here. And yeah, it's got to be my least favorite De La Soul album, honestly, as much as I want to like it and respect it, because in a lot of ways it is pretty daring. Like, it's a big album. It's a robust album. There was clearly a lot of effort put into it, and it has one of the wildest freaking feature lists of any hip hop album ever. Rock Marciano, Jill Scott, Snoop Dogg, Justin Hawkins of The Darkness, also David Byrne, Little Dragon, Damon Albarn, as well as 2 Chainz, and Usher is in the mix too. It's kind of insane, the number of people that De La Soul have on this record, and it's really creative how they use a lot of their guests to implement different sounds and styles. Like, a lot of different vibes and aesthetics on this thing are covered, from that Snoopy's track featuring David Byrne to CBGB's, which has a slight punk tinge to it. With that being said, a lot of the beats on this thing are a mess. Some of the experimentation with genre the trio does here and there just does not pan out. Plus, I find a lot of the rapping on this LP to be a little, frankly, unenthusiastic. So much so it makes me kind of wonder why they dropped the album to begin with. Because while, yeah, I didn't necessarily go into this thing expecting the high energy and, the kooky vibes of the debut, I couldn't even get the energy level that was being brought during the AOI series. Even that bar isn't met on this thing. And what we end up getting is a very out there, a very risky, and a very versatile, but messy, ill-conceived, and low-energy album that, again, is my least favorite De La Soul album. I would put this over in the D tier for De La, De La, De La. There you have it. That is my De La Soul tier list. Read it and weep. Let me know yours down in the comments. You're the best. Love you. Mwah. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, De La Soul, forever.